Hi, I'm Krista Pontier, Regional President for Greater Toronto at RBC. We're proud to collaborate with TIFF to bring you some incredible films by Indigenous creators from around the world. RBC strives to work in partnership with Indigenous peoples and their allies in pursuit of truth and reconciliation, and we commit to supporting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people for generations to come. We also believe inclusive storytelling matters and that the voices of Indigenous communities should be heard, valued, and respected. These powerful stories of joy, love, and hope are important to celebrate as we look to a better future. We hope that by watching, you become inspired to reflect on the histories and experiences of Indigenous communities. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to a conversation with Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers and Adam Piron. As you join us today, we encourage you to reflect on the land that you are on and its history. I am located on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississauga of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant and is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We are grateful to work on this land and to showcase the work of Indigenous creators. My name is Hoda Ali, and I am part of the audience and community team here at TIFF. I would like to extend a sincere thank you to our lead sponsors, Bell, and our major sponsors, RBC, L'Oreal Paris, and Visa, as well as to our major supporters, the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario and the City of Toronto, for their continued support. RBC is proud to support TIFF's programming in honor of National Indigenous History Month. I would also like to thank our members and donors for their support of everything we do at TIFF. Curated by guest programmer Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers, Stories Are Power is a series that showcases feature films by Indigenous creators around the world. Stories Are Power is presented in collaboration with our community partner, imagineNATIVE, and is available now on digital TIFF Bell Box. We hope that you will watch and join in celebrating the works and stories of Indigenous creators. To lead this conversation, I'm going to turn it over to our host, Niki Little. Niki is Anishinaabe British from the Garden Hill First Nation in northern Manitoba. She is the artistic director of the imagineNATIVE Film and Media Arts Festival, and previously was the director of the National Indigenous Media Arts Coalition, where she organized Listen, Witness, Transmit, a national Indigenous media arts gathering in Saskatoon. Over to you, Niki.
Hello, Nin. My name is Niki Little, and I just wanted to say miigwech to the team at TIFF for inviting imagineNATIVE to be a part of this programming. As mentioned, my name is Niki Little, Wabshki Mayangan, and I'm from Kisigawnwajing First Nation, a flying community in northern Manitoba. I'm super honored to be able to share space with two folks in the Indigenous community that I admire, Adam Piron and Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers. And I'll just give a brief introduction to their practices. Adam Piron is a filmmaker and a film programmer based in Southern California. He is a member of the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma and of Mohawk descent. He was raised in Phoenix, Arizona, and his films have played at True Falls Film Festival, AFI Docs, MoMA Doc Fortnight, San Francisco International Film Festival, and various other festivals. He is also the co-founder of Cousin, a collective supporting Indigenous artists expanding the form of film. He received his BFA in film production from the University of Southern California School of Cinematic Arts, and is currently works as the associate director of the Sundance Institute's Indigenous program. Also joining us today is Elle-Máijá Tailfeathers, a filmmaker, writer, and actor based in Vancouver, British Columbia. She is Blackfoot from Kainai First Nation, as well as Sámi from Northern Norway. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of British Columbia in Indigenous Studies with a minor in Women's and Gender Studies. Her debut feature, The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, premiered at the Berlin International Film Festival and was selected for Canada's Top 10 in 2020. She most recently directed Gima Bitsin, The Meaning of Empathy, which premiered at Hot Docs this year. And also just be aware that later this year, you can see her in Dana Goulet's Night Raiders. And I just wanted to thank you both for coming here today. So welcome. How are you today?
Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Oh my, I was gonna hop in or not. Yeah, no, doing good today. Thanks Niki and TIFF and Maya for having me here.
Yeah.
How are you doing, Elle-Máijá?
I'm doing well. It's really nice to be here, and yeah, I just want to thank you and TIFF, and yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Perfect. So just thinking about the conversation today, we're going to be talking about Indigenous cinema, and I was really hoping to get some perspectives from both yourself as programmers and working within the community in various capacities, as well as filmmakers. So let's start with, what is Indigenous cinema? Maybe both of you could, maybe we'll start with you, Adam. What is your interpretation, or how you've come to know Indigenous cinema?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and this is like my own sort of personal definition, not authoritative by any means or anything. I think for me, I see it a lot more as kind of a quality. I think of it as work that's done by Indigenous artists either for or somehow centering Indigenous audiences as well. And that can be across genre, it can be across formal approach or anything like that. I mean, that's kind of, I think that's more to sort of like the real sort of like high level view that I see it as. And yeah, that's again for me, and again too, it's like, I think it's a quality, because I think it's also, I was talking about this with somebody yesterday, but I think it's like, it's not to like also flatten a lot of other like Indigenous nations that are doing all of this work. I know it can kind of at times be a little bit of like a bucket that a lot of work gets sort of put into based off of who's making it. But I do think it's like, there's a lot of sort of specific qualities to it that I think, also like, which is part of the reason we've all kind of, us here in this chat, have kind of like gathered together, or like we've met each other in the past, or even, folks from other parts of the globe and stuff like that. I do think that that's something that's particularly unique to Indigenous cinema, in the sense that it's as much of a community as well too as it is a quality. So
that's a really great point. I like that community aspect within it, because I heard, Elle-Máijá, if you wouldn't mind also talking about this, I've heard you speak about sort of the power within Indigenous cinema, and talking about it through that kind of lens. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more from your perspective.
Sure. Yeah, I think Adam was absolutely right about it being a quality, and it being about centering Indigenous audiences. I guess for me as a filmmaker, it's also about process, or I think it's primarily about process. So it's something I've been, really investigating personally in my work as a filmmaker, trying to figure out, like, what does narrative sovereignty mean? What does it mean to be an Indigenous storyteller? And I think it can mean so many different things. But I think we all come from cultures where we are taught and encouraged to speak from experience, and to speak from our own personal understanding of the way the world works, and not speak for necessarily an entire community. And so for me in my work, it's about implementing Blackfoot and Sámi teachings, ways of relating to my community, and ways of relating to story and family and the land. And how can I implement all of that into the way that I make films? And in many cases, it's those concepts and those teachings are like, just do not run parallel to like conventional Western ways of making films and telling stories. So it's been a really challenging but also beautiful and enriching process in terms of like trying to discover and build a process that reflects the people and the places that I come from, and that centers Indigenous voices and the people from those places. And I kind of, I guess, I don't know, it sounds really cheesy, but like I strive to make films that would make my grandparents proud. I strive to make work that makes the people that I know and love feel seen and heard and understood and represented. And I want to make work that makes them feel good, because so much of the work out there about us doesn't really feel good to watch as an Indigenous person. So I think Indigenous cinema is all of those things. It can mean different things to to many people. You know, I feel like we can't just like narrow it down to one specific definition.
For sure. And I definitely, you know, feel and hear some of those embodied practices that you're speaking to, and especially like in relation to the land and where your nation is. I think also definitely that worldview really come through. And so there's such a beautiful constellation of Indigenous nations out there that it would be so hard to narrow it down. I was wondering if we could maybe, you brought up narrative sovereignty, and it kind of just made me think about authorship, and especially, you know, some of the stories that we're talking about or that have come through are not necessarily our own personal stories. For example, like you can't claim ownership over it. For an example, could you talk through a little bit like working with ancestral story and how you've seen that handled in a way, and sort of this maybe pendulum of, you know, an individual creating a specific kind of story, but then you have all of these threads that you had mentioned: land, your family, kinship, worldviews that come into play, and then maybe potentially like an ancestral story, or like these moments where oral stories or traditional stories or stories with continuum come into play within the mix. I was wondering if you could maybe talk about authorship, I suppose, because Adam, I've heard you talk about it before in a couple of different capacities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something I've been like thinking about a lot as well recently too. I mean, like I've been working on this like one project that's like, I mean, it's taken a while, but like I finally finished like an outline of it, and it's kind of like a really, I mean, it's like my own thing, but it's like a really sort of like weird interpretation, I guess you could say, of like a traditional story, but also kind of like mashing up different ones. And it was like, I don't know, like I've been thinking a lot about kind of the authorship question of that, of it being like kind of to what you were saying is like, you know, should a traditional story only remain in kind of a traditional form? And, you know, like, who do you consult about something like that? Or at what point, if it's something specifically from your own community, like at what point does like, I don't want to say does the community stop, it's not that, but like at what point does your own voice kind of factor into some of the decision making of some of that stuff? And I don't have a totally good answer or even a formed answer for that, to be honest, yet. I mean, I think I think it sort of just depends on each project to a certain extent. And I think if there is some level of like community agreement or something, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I think at least in terms of having that type of stewardship with it. But I think like in terms of the authorship, yeah, I think it's, which correct me if I'm not getting the question right, but I think it's like, I think the authorship question to a certain extent is it's a little bit tricky. Like, I think it's because I think one of the things too is I think because as, you know, Indigenous artists and stuff, and again, going to what Maya was saying, it's not speaking for everybody necessarily with this, but I do question, like, you know, when engaging with film, like at what point are we, or should we be engaging with, like, you know, sort of ideas of like authorship, so to speak, in terms of that, like, you know, at what point is it like more of a community thing? At what point is it more of a voice? So I know that's like a really mushy answer, like non-answer, but I think that's kind of like, in terms of my own mind, that's kind of like, I think where I'm at with that right now. And I think it's, I do think that, and this is another thing I've also brought up to kind of, again, offer a bit more of like a nebulous, flat answer of like Indigenous cinema. I think that, which I always tell people, and I think maybe some folks don't totally, non-Indigenous people get necessarily, even some Indigenous people I think maybe don't get it, but there's like a huge difference between like the Indigenous image in film and even like that whole history, and Indigenous cinema and like the authorship and what that authorship means. So again, too, kind of a weird nebulous non-answer in general, but like that's kind of like, those are my thoughts on it. So.
And how about you, Elle-Máijá? Because you've spoken, I also, you know, you work a lot with your documentary and your most recent film, you know, working with community, and certainly you have your perspective within there, but you're also working with a collective of folks, and sort of your process in which engaging with those spaces, and then also how to craft that story, I suppose.
Yeah, again, I think it comes down to process. And I, as Adam said, it's different from project to project. Sorry, we were working till like 2 a.m. last night, and I'm like I feel like half conscious right now. So I'm struggling to find words. But as Adam said, it varies from project to project, and story to story. It depends on what kind of story you're telling. With Gimmabi Bitsin, The Meaning of Empathy, it's about my community's response to the opioid crisis, and it's kind of an investigation of harm reduction through an Indigenous lens and the way that it's been implemented in my community and the ways that it is and isn't working. And as someone who knew so little about harm reduction before starting, and someone with, I think kind of like the basic understanding of addiction, in that like my family members have had addictions and I know it in that way, but I don't understand necessarily the complexities of treating addiction. So I understood that in telling this story, and representing a community of like 14,000 people, all with different experiences, and recognizing that we're all connected to this community experience, like it's a collective experience, was a huge undertaking in terms of the responsibilities of authorship and accountability to community, and ensuring that I wasn't imposing my own beliefs or opinions in a way that wasn't reflective of the diversity of opinions and experiences within my community. And so initially it was kind of like, this is going to be sort of a conventional documentary where we have, a few key participants or characters, and it'll be verite and we'll experience the story in this way. But very early on in the process, I realized that was just not the way to tell the story, and that I needed to approach it from like a place of deep listening and understanding and learning from as many people within my community as possible, and finding a way to represent that multitude of voices and opinions and experiences in a way that was respectful, because in my experience of our Blackfoot culture and teachings, we listen to everyone. Everybody has purpose and value, and everybody's experience is valid, and so I needed to approach it from that perspective. And so I think in terms of authorship, and my position as the filmmaker in that particular project, it was also about, first and foremost, my position as a community member, and how can I serve my community, and how can I tell this story in a way that, again, reflects the fact that there are so many different opinions, so many different experiences, and so many people doing work on various levels to find solutions. And I also obviously had to consider audience first and foremost, and I think that deeply influences Indigenous cinema. Is who are we making this for? And I come from the prairies, and as we know, the prairies are like so explicitly racist. Like racism is so present in a way that I don't necessarily experience in an urban center like Vancouver. And so I felt also a responsibility to challenge these like very deeply rooted racist ideologies about Indigenous people and addiction, and the fact that there's this idea that we created this problem, that we are all inherently flawed and come from a place of deficit. And so the film was also like a resistance, a way of resisting that, of demonstrating that we didn't create the problem, but we're finding the solutions. And these are all of the people that are working so hard for the solutions. And these are all of the people who deserve to be treated and recognized as human beings. And as a filmmaker, it was my responsibility to like make all of that work. And I think a lot of Indigenous creatives feel that way as well, like this heavy burden of, not necessarily heavy burden, but a deeply ingrained responsibility accountability and commitment to our communities, because at the end of the day, you can't just walk away from the places and the people that you come from, because I don't know, to me, that's everything that I am. And so, yeah, so there's that consistent sort of like tension of like representing your community in a way that is thoughtful and respectful and ethical, and also kind of like consistently having to navigate this like settler colonial world we live in, and dealing with the idea that settlers will most likely watch our work, and what does it mean to make work only for Indigenous audiences, and for me, that's generally the audience that I consider first and foremost is an Indigenous audience, and is my community, and how are they going to feel when they watch this? And yeah, basically it's like consistently trying not to screw up like for my community, you know?
Well, I really liked like a lot of the ideas that you were touching down upon, especially around like collective responsibility, deep listening, that accountability that I think a lot of us carry. And I think there's also a humility in there that, you know, doesn't often get talked about, but understanding, you know, being able to pivot and to like have an expectation and be like, actually, you know what, this response isn't the way to go about telling the story. We need to move and shift into a way that is more caring for the story. And I do hear a lot of care in your process, which is really lovely to hear, especially from the types of stories that we deal with sometimes, or we consider making, and ensuring that they have like that humanity is in there. And I think that's really a key part too. And especially in Indigenous stories, I feel like we've lacked humanity for a long time in other spaces. And so to be able to see this now is really amazing. And Adam, I've heard you talk also too about like one of the aspects of Indigenous cinema being about that audience and being seen. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I wouldn't say it's like, it's not tricky, but I mean, I think like, you know, somebody whose work I greatly admire, and, you know, he's a friend and everything, is like, you know, definitely somebody like Sky Mpinka, for example. Like, I think his works are really great examples of kind of that, where it's, you know, it's made with, I think, a certain community in mind, or at least sort of like a certain approach and things like that. And I think it's one of those things where it's not necessarily something that like alienates like a non-Indigenous audience as well too, but they're not the ones that are being centered, if that makes sense. And I think that it's still something that they can approach that work and leave with something out of it as well. And I think, you know, if you're Indigenous and you come to it, it's, even if you're not from the community that's in those films, I think you still also are able to connect on some level with something there, you know. But I think, yeah, in terms of like, I think the audience, it's like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it's like, I do feel like depending on what corner of film you're working on, at least in the US, it's, you know, we're not like a huge audience down here. We also don't have like a lot of the, you know, the same sort of media infrastructure that Canada or other countries have and stuff for Indigenous audiences. And I think like, I don't know, like, and I'm also just speaking for myself too. I know other people don't necessarily have this tension maybe, but I think there's one thing that I've been really kind of like trying to work through is sort of the idea of like legibility and like, who is it legible for, if that makes sense. And I think it's also just sort of like my own, you know, my past 15 years here on Earth. No, just kidding, 34. But like, no, but like, I think like, you know, really the idea of thinking of like, you know, even for myself, like, what have I been taught is like a good film, or like, you know, what is an approachable film, or how should a film be told? But really, you know, really trying to rethink of like, how would you tell something like this for an Indigenous audience? Or like, how do you draw from your own culture in terms of, you know, traditional storytelling methods that can be repurposed or, you know, reimagined and stuff like that. And And, I think also, like, which is a radical idea in my mind, is, really thinking of, like, what if this is just for Indigenous audiences? Like, it's not, you have to think of it beyond sort of like, which is, again, also in the US, it's a tricky kind of thing, unless if you're working in like a purely independent space, of like the idea of like, really sort of, I think, in a lot of ways, like reorganizing your mind and trying to push out the idea of like some type of commerciality to it. I think, if that makes sense. I think that needs to be focused on the craft. And again, too, I think that it's something that, can be open to a lot of different audiences. But I think that it's, like I said, too, the US is a very capitalist place. And I think it's, that you find out how much that sort of affects your thoughts of, who you're trying to tell this for, and how you compromise or don't compromise on something like that. So yeah, that's been something that I've been trying to navigate for the last, I'd say, probably year and a half. So.
And I can imagine, especially just getting, I can imagine just getting a project going as well, and sort of mobilizing from where the initial ideas. And we all know kind of how funding, like getting that motivation for funding, getting people to back your project in real livable ways and living wages for your folks and your crew is a big initiative and a big undertaking. So I appreciate you sharing that perspective from the States, because it is really, I think we are quite lucky in Canada to have a lot of the different aspects and kind of different ways in which people can make work. And I was wondering, Elle-Máijá, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to a Canadian context, if you will, in your experience about that.
About funding?
Sure. I guess maybe just about like being a filmmaker in Canada right now. Are you seeing a lot of opportunity? Is it in sort of the arc, I suppose, or trajectory of the industry? Are you finding, like, do you notice those articulations of like maybe capitalism or like weaving to a funder? Because sometimes, you see this grant out there and you're like, oh, I think I can make this fit. Or, or just having that really strong resilience and sticking to the core of the story and like kind of moving forward it that way, and the process within that, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. I think it involves a lot of strategy, which I'm still learning and navigating through. We made The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open at a time when there was really key change happening within the Canadian industry in terms of Indigenous cinema and the opportunities that have been made available to us. So there have been so many people involved in advocacy and activism and pushing Canadian funding bodies and film institutions to give us an equitable share of the resources that are available. And I think that can be said for so many, marginalized voices. And because of all of that advocacy, because of all of that work, there have been, new initiatives to get somewhere closer to parity or equity in terms of what's available to us in order to make the films that we want to make. And so we made The Body Remembers at this like really interesting moment where suddenly there were resources available. I mean, we definitely needed more, but we managed to make what we hoped to make with kind of just enough. And it had to do with all of that work. But that being said, it's kind of like with every project I've made, it's been a matter of kind of strategizing. And it's interesting that Adam brought up legibility, because there's this like tension between capitalism and the industry, the mainstream industry, and being able to live as an artist, as a filmmaker, but also resisting that, because that is the problem. Capitalism, colonialism, that's like why our people have experienced so much pain and loss over the last however many 100 years. And so, yeah, it's this consistent tension of having to navigate both of those worlds, I guess, and remaining accountable and respectful and ethical with story and community and And so, yeah, it's certainly been about navigating legibility to Canadian funders and financiers in a way that, you know, they kind of understand maybe what I'm trying to say and do, while also ensuring that what I'm doing is centering my community or Indigenous voices, or centering the teachings that I've been brought up with, if that makes sense. And sometimes those things are like the total antithesis of one another, and it's a matter of like learning to say no, and yeah, just learning to navigate all of that. But I think that applies to everything that we do as Indigenous people in this like modern capitalist society that we're all kind of like trapped in. So yeah, I don't know, I'm kind of rambling, but that's, I guess, what I have to say about that.
Well, I'm happy you touched back down on that tension part, because I think that is, you know, especially, you know, then integrating your own practice, you know, you as yourself as a filmmaker want to evolve, want to push yourself. So there's all of these different access points that you have to kind of move forward and to get the project done. And I was wondering, we just have a couple more minutes, I think. So if you could maybe speak to, I had two questions, I guess. I wanted to speak about the archive within Indigenous cinema and sort of the relationship to archives. And you brought up Sky's practice before, Adam. So maybe I really love the way he works with archive and kind of like expands, I suppose, the kinship, if you will, in those spaces. And then my final question after would be, what Indigenous film has impacted you in a way or kind of resonated with you that you can still recall? So archive and then a film.
Well, I don't think I could really sort of speak for Sky or his process when it comes to that, just because I guess I haven't really talked to him too much about about that. Like, I mean, I just talk to him just like we're friends, or occasionally I'll ask him stuff about his films. But like, I think it's like, I don't know, like I think with the archive, I think in general, like, I don't know. Yeah, it's and again too, in this just speaking from the States and kind of my own stuff, like I had this thing that played at Momadoc Fortnight that was part of like the cousin program that we had play there, and that was from an archival. I was working on this piece that was like purely archival, kind of through the pandemic and stuff, and it was like this piece that I had found out about, like my great great grandfather was in this silent film that was just about like, I guess it was kind of a Western. It wasn't really, because it was like an all native cast and stuff, and there's this whole weird story. But at first I was like, I'm just gonna rip this footage, like, you know, like this is my family's image, I don't care, blah blah blah. Like, and then like the distributor reached out, and he was just like super nice and just was like, yeah, you can have like whatever you want, like don't worry about it, like just credit us or whatever. And I was like, okay, that's cool, like whatever. But I mean, I think it's and I think that's a very sort of not out of the usual kind of case. But I think like in terms of engaging with the archive, I think it's a little sort of the roles of the archives and stuff like that. I think, I don't know, I mean, maybe Maya will disagree with me on this, and I totally welcome it and hope I can be corrected if I'm wrong on this. But I think like, given sort of like, again, the history of like the Indigenous image in film, and, you know, when you look back at even like, you know, some of the really early stuff, like the, you know, some of the Edison shorts, or even as Westerns were starting to come out as a genre, because, you know, it was a bunch of people from Wild West shows that were kind of bleeding into this new film industry and stuff like that for work. I think it's to a certain extent, I think that there's always something that like, and I mean, I don't know, hopefully maybe it's just now, maybe it'll get to the point where it's not that anymore. But I think like the very nature of Indigenous people making films, at least within the US, and I would think Canada and elsewhere as well, and, you know, just sort of given the ethnographic history of a lot of, you know, this technology and stuff like that, I think that there's something that's kind of inherently reactionary to that history. And I think in the sense of it being that like our image has been something that has not been something under our control through this medium. But I think that by us doing that, there is something there's something there. And I think, whether some folks like, whether it is something that is a purely conscious thing or an unconscious thing, that's my view on it, at least. But yeah, and I think that there is a certain sort of power, for lack of a better term, for like, ripping some of that stuff off, and what are they going to do? Say like, oh yeah, sorry, that's ours, which, I mean, I guess they could, but it's not cool. But it kind of points to the whole problem. But yeah, and I think like, kind of it's something that's always been kind of there. And I think, again, it's to a certain extent, there is like something that's reactionary to it, in the sense that it's just, that's what it is. And, that's the history of it. But I mean, I think like, maybe something for myself in terms of a film that I feel is like really sort of merged some of that, but also like really kind of like taken a totally different spin on that is, this film out of Australia called The Dark Side by Warwick Thornton. I remember when I saw that actually at imagineNATIVE, like I want to say that was back in 2015 or something like that. That film kind of blew my mind, because it was like, I think, Warwick had put out a call for people to share their some of their encounters with like the supernatural and things like that. And the way that he had reinterpreted a lot of those stories in a way that it sort of played with the idea of ethnography, but it also like, for me, that was like one of the first films I saw that like, again, that like really sort of expanded my idea of like what was possible within Indigenous cinema. Yeah, it's never been released in the US. So, I mean, that's like the one time I've seen it. I've always tried to track down a copy of it, and I've never been able to totally pull the trigger on it. But yeah, so, I mean, I think those are kind of my thoughts on that. So.
And how about you, Elle-Máijá? So I guess the question was around the archive, just in general, whether it's a personal archive or your relationship to it, and how have you, from your perspective, seen that within Indigenous cinema utilized, or the process has been presented in, and then also a film that has resonated with you in your practice, or just as an audience member.
Yeah, I think it's a really complicated topic. I mean, one is that the archive is never a complete picture. It's just it's just a tiny moment that was captured by whoever was behind the camera, and we don't always know what their intention was, and they're never getting the complete picture, and we never and when it comes to like the documentation of Indigenous people in the archives, when that documentation came from a non-Indigenous person, there's definitely a power imbalance that's going to be there. That being said, I'm grateful that there is an archive of these images. Colin Lowe was a settler from my part of the world, and he documented my community many times over the years. And it's interesting because our community reveres Colin Lowe, and he was a really good person. He hosted my mother in Montreal when she did this like Canadian youth thing in the 70s, and he had a good relationship with our community. That being said, he often somewhat got it wrong in terms of the depiction of our people. Like Circle of the Sun is kind of this film that's like revered within our community, because when we see it, we see so many of the people that we know and love, or ancestors, relatives. I think the film was shot in maybe like 1959 or something like that. But it was a documentation of like supposedly the end of the Sundance, our sacred Sundance that happens every year. And the idea was like, there's this guy named Pete standing alone, this young man who was like about to venture off into the modern world and like leave his ways behind, because they were we were a dying race essentially. And now the Sundance is like the biggest it's ever been, and it's this beautiful thing to witness and participate in, and to know that he was so wrong. But also the fact that film exists, and the fact that we have this footage is really incredible. And I was able to use some of that in my latest documentary. And so, yeah, I think it's a really complicated relationship with the archives, because on one hand, I'm grateful that these images exist. I'm grateful that there is like a way to engage with them. But also it's like, it's a documentation of like a major power imbalance. And we can't always trust that what we're seeing was any sort of like accurate depiction of reality in that moment, or the experience of the people that we see in front of the camera in that moment. But then when it comes to like the archive of Indigenous cinema, I think there's a real conversation that has to happen around accessibility. Like, so many of our people don't have access to our films. And I think that's kind of like maybe one of the next waves of work that is going to be done and tackled, in terms of like just making sure that our own people and our own communities are seeing our work. One of the reasons I didn't like go to film school or even consider becoming a filmmaker was because I didn't have access to Indigenous cinema. I didn't really even think that I could be a filmmaker. It wasn't within my like realm of consciousness, because I didn't, you can't see what, you can't become what you can't see, right? And so I think that's something we need to really focus on in terms of the work that needs to be done, is like making sure that our own people are seeing our films and our work and our stories. And a lot of that has to do with like, I guess the value that's placed on our work and the value that's placed on Indigenous voices and stories. So often our work and our stories are diminished or like relegated to something that isn't of value within like the mainstream world of cinema. So I think it is changing. We are witnessing a massive change, especially in like, I would say the last 7 years, in terms of like this massive movement to seeing more and more Indigenous features, and features that are geared towards Indigenous audiences. And it's been really fantastic to witness non-Indigenous audiences being drawn to our stories, even when those stories or those films are being made for an Indigenous audience specifically. And so that's really powerful to me as a filmmaker, and just as an Indigenous person, to know that, I don't know, it gives me hope, because it can feel hopeless, some days existing as an Indigenous person, just witnessing the violence that we have to experience all the time. And so to know that our stories have a future, to know that there's people that care about our stories, to know that there is value to our stories, that gives me hope. And then in terms of films that have had an influence on me, there's two like very, I think kind of like obvious films. One is Ofalash, or Pathfinder, by Neil Scope. It's a Sámi film, one of the first like Indigenous language features. It was made in the 80s, I think. And I saw that as a child, and that just to see my culture and my people on screen in a way that was like normalized, and to hear our language in a way that just like was normalized. And that was really powerful. And then obviously Acknowledgements at the Fast Runner, I think that's kind of like a really key kind of iconic film for all Indigenous people, just because it really changed everything for us. But yeah, there's been so many features in the last few years, especially, that have like really blown me away. And I feel like if I start naming them, then I'll just like forget others. And then like tomorrow I'll be like, damn it, I should have mentioned this film and that film. But yeah, I think, Sky Hopinka's work is really powerful. Lisa Jackson's work is so powerful. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do the whole list because I'm going to forget people. And I have just like such a profound respect and awe for our entire community. And there's so many talented Indigenous filmmakers. And I'm just honored to belong to that community and to be fed and nourished by that community. And yeah, there I go, rambling again.
Thank you. for that answer. I really appreciate it. And it is hard to name sort of those moments that resonate with you, or, you know, not to share space as well. So I really appreciate you both taking the time out to talk about Indigenous cinema and going on this ride with me in this conversation. Is there any final thoughts that you would like to share with our audiences today? Well, speaking of access and speaking of seeing more Indigenous film, I just wanted to mention that actually Elle-Máijá, you had curated a program, correct, on the TIFF Lightbox. And so actually Canadian audiences can watch Stories Are Power programs on digital TIFF Bell Lightbox by visiting digital.tiff.net. And also at imagineNATIVE, we have Feature Fridays happening, and I believe we have Alanis Vamsawin's film, and then we're ending with Smoke Signals in the last of June for our June celebrations. So thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it, and so lovely to see you both, and I hope your families are well.
Thank you. It was an honor to have this conversation.
Thanks.